For this module, we're going to be talking about freedom and slavery in antebellum America. The term antebellum applies to the 40-year period between 1820 and 1860. What we're going to be looking at in this lecture, for the most part, is just a brief look at what life was like for free blacks in antebellum America. I think your textbook covers information on slavery in America, but sometimes we tend to lose sight of what it must have been like to be free in a society where black slavery was the norm. For this unit, or for this lecture, we're going to focus on the demographics of freedom, who lived where, and how many free blacks there were. We're going to take a look primarily at what this meant in terms of freedom in the North. We'll talk about community life and institution building in northern free black communities. By comparison, we'll take a very brief look at slavery in the Upper South, and freedom in the Upper South and freedom in the Deep South. In terms of the numbers for the free black population as a percentage of the whole, if you just focus on that quotation at the top of that graph, quote, although the number of free African Americans doubled in size between 1820 and 1860, their proportion relative to the total black population actually decreased. This indicates that the institution of slavery seemed unlikely to be ended voluntarily by Southerners. All right, just think about that in terms of the numbers of free blacks. Numbers are doubling, but their proportion in terms of the total black population is not. It is shrinking. It is decreasing. In 1820, in terms of out of a total black population of 1.77 million, 87% were slave, 13% were free blacks. By 1860, out of a total population of 4.44 million, 89% are slave, 11% are free blacks. Now, what are the reasons for these decreases in the percentages of free blacks? Number one, an increase in the number of slaves from 1.5 million out of a 9 million total population to 230, compared to 233,000 free blacks. You're going to 4 million slaves out of a total population, 4 million slaves out of a total American population of 31 million, and about 488,070 free blacks. Then the second thing that's happening is that it was becoming more difficult to free slaves in some states where slavery was an important part of the economy. Remember the complexities of Washington's will. An individual slave owner might want to free his or her slaves, but personal issues like a wife and the intermixing of the slave property that belonged to the man and the woman, as well as state politics, state legislatures, making it more difficult for individual owners to free their slaves. All of these made it almost impossible, almost, but not quite impossible, for slaveholders in the South to consider freeing their slaves. Now, at the end of the lecture, we're going to talk just a little bit about what it was like to have been one of the free blacks who was manumitted in the South and who chose to remain in the South. Now, when we talk about free blacks, we also have to realize that we're looking at 3 regions in the country by 1860. We've got the North, where you've got a free black population of 226,152 by 1860. The Deep South, the Upper South rather, when you have a free black population of 244,963. And then the Deep South, just a little over, well over 36,000, not quite 37,000 free blacks. Most free blacks are in the North and the Upper South. And again, the total, there are very few in the Deep South, and the total population by 1860, look at that, 26,957,472. So just compare these free black populations, put them all together. You've got close to, very close to, 500,000 free blacks. Now, what was it like to be black and free? While manumission was difficult in the slaveholding South, gradual or immediate emancipation laws just after the Revolutionary War had created substantial black populations in northern states. But what was this freedom like? Well, despite their freedom, they're still having to deal with some just general northern attitudes toward African Americans, or white attitudes toward African Americans. For example, white Northerners, like many white Southerners, considered African Americans, slave or free, to be inferior. They dismissed African Americans as incapable of honest work. If you're looking at the North, if this is the free black population, they also feared job competition from blacks, and they felt that contact with blacks had degraded white Southerners. So they wanted to restrict the movement of free blacks. Consequently, you've got segregation laws in northern communities. The only place that you have total exclusionary legislation would be in the states that were carved out of the old Northwest Territory, where they would make laws that would make it difficult for free blacks to migrate into states like Indiana. They would have to pay a bond guaranteeing their good behavior to come into those states. But even if you didn't have exclusionary legislature that was designed to keep them out of these communities, in other communities, you had a pervasive discrimination that tended to victimize all blacks in these areas. There were restrictions on their ability to find rooms in hotels, to visit taverns, to enjoy public transportation. There was an atmosphere of hate that caused African Americans to distrust white people. In some cities, you even had exclusive neighborhoods or ghettos in most northern cities where free blacks were confined. They might live in every ward or district in a city, but within those wards and districts, they might be confined to certain streets. These would be the only places that they could find housing. Southern visitors sometimes argued that blacks were better off as slaves in the South than they were as free blacks in the North because of these patterns of discrimination and segregation. In most northern areas, disfranchisement or not allowing free blacks to vote was fairly common. And the only exceptions to this would be in New England. But on the other hand, if you kind of put this in line with your American history classes or what you learned in American history, you know that until the 1820s, property qualifications prevented most people who did not own property from enjoying the suffrage. So you start out with the restriction on voting that is according to property, but in the antebellum period, that restriction on voting is becoming more and more widespread based on race. The strongest opposition was in the Old Northwest, where blacks had never been allowed to vote. And even with universal manhood suffrage, which is evolving during this period, this restriction on voting becomes one of class, moves rather from one of class to one of race. Before the Civil War, 93% of northern blacks lived in states where the right to vote was either denied or severely limited. They were restricted to exclusive black neighborhoods or to segregated neighborhoods. But within these neighborhoods, we also have to take a look at the communities that were emerging. In terms of family life, free blacks created very resilient families. Up until 1820, two-parent households within free black communities were common. But from about 1820 until 1860, there was a trend towards single-parent generally female-headed households. Much of this has to do with economics and the fact that it was becoming increasingly difficult for free black men to find jobs in urban areas where they could support their families. Free black communities, or free black people in these communities, in the north, and also in the south, as we'll see in a minute, tended to be poor neighborhoods. For men, they were confined primarily to menial labor, things like laborers or jobs like working as general laborers or draymen or people who drove the carts, hauling supplies from place to place. Better paying jobs were very limited, and when they could find these better paying jobs, they were as coachmen, teamsters, waiters, barbers, and carpenters, sometimes masons or plasterers. An interesting statistic, as a kind of a sidelight of this, is that one of the jobs that they could find, free blacks could find in northern communities, was as a seaman on a sailing ship. About 50% of the crewmen on American merchant and whaling vessels were black, which kind of changes ideas of what the crew of a whaling ship, like we see in the novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville, what that crew must have looked like. 50% would have been black. By the 1850s, free blacks were losing out even on unskilled work, as they had to compete more and more with Irish immigrants who had started coming into the country in the 1840s. They were competing for these unskilled or semi-skilled jobs with free blacks. Jobs as working on the docks or as draymen, railroad workers, or just people who carried heavy troughs on which they would pile bricks or mortar from place to place, or as porters and shoe shiners. What you see happening in many northern communities as far as free blacks are concerned is a general de-skilling of the urban black population. Young black men are excluded from apprenticeships because of racial discrimination. Consequently, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to find work in any kind of profession that requires training. Professions like carpentry or blacksmithing. There was also violence used against employers to keep them from hiring blacks. Barbering and shoemaking, on the other hand, continued to dominate as occupations for black men in most cities, north and south. As far as women are concerned, for the most part, the work that they can find tended to be domestic labor, working as washerwomen, working as maids. When they could find jobs that required a certain level of skill, it might be as a cook, or as a seamstress, or as a hairdresser, or a milliner, a person who makes hats, or sometimes as a nurse, nursing or taking care of children. Free black communities increasingly were characterized by class differences. You begin to see the emergence of a small black elite in these communities, and this elite was made up primarily of ministers like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen and James Varick, of physicians like James McCoon Smith or John S. Rock or Martin Delaney, lawyers, artists and musicians. Robert Edmondson was a landscape artist, one of the most prominent and popular landscape artists of the 19th century. Authors and teachers, people like Frederick Douglass, William Nell, William Wells Brown, and Maria Stewart. Free blacks increasingly began to develop an institutional life in the cities. They created newspapers and journals, newspapers like Freedom's Journal and North Star. They organized voluntary associations like mutual aid societies that were attractive to women, or Black Odd Fellows or the Prince Hall Masons. They organized literary and reform societies like the Phoenix Literary Society or Temperance or temperance societies that helped to unite the black community. Other institutions that became prominent in the black community were things like public schools, or just education in general. I shouldn't say public schools because in many cases there were restrictions on black education in northern cities just as there were in southern cities. Schools were segregated in the North between 1820 and 1860. And again, most people believed that this was necessary because they thought that black children lacked mental capacity, that they would not be able to make it in these schools, and would just generally pull down the literacy of all students who were attending. They would lower the quality of education. They feared that black students, if they allowed black students to attend public schools in a district, that this would attract more blacks to the district. Therefore, many black children were excluded from public schools. Frederick Douglass recalled in his autobiography that after he and his wife had escaped and made their way to the North, and had eventually settled in Rochester, New York, that he was appalled that the Rochester schools denied his children, his daughter, an education. Free blacks and sympathetic whites to remedy this problem of this lack of education that was open to black children by opening private schools. One of the strongest black institutions in the black community, in fact, the core of the black community, was the black church. The churches were concerned with the spiritual needs of the people, and in the North, ministers were political leaders of their communities. Churches very often housed the private schools that were opened by free blacks, as well as the social organizations, and eventually the anti-slavery societies that developed. In many cases, black churches, grew out of benevolent and moral improvement societies like the Free African Union Society or the Free African Society. Now, these sound like they're pretty much the same organization, but they're very different. The Free African Union Society was founded in 1780 in Newport, Rhode Island. It was a benevolent and moral improvement society, as well as an agency that promoted black immigration back to Africa. It encouraged members to refrain from idleness and drunkenness. It was a moral society. And it tried to ensure that the membership made their marriages legal and promoted investment in real estate. The group promoted investment in real estate. The society provided death benefits for wives, widows, and children of deceased members, and furnished loans to the needy and held weekly religious services. The Free African Union Society tried to create a consensus on the subject of a Back to Africa movement. Recall that at the beginning of your chapter, there's a short reading. The introductory reading has to do with James Forden in Philadelphia, and this question that comes before a group of people in that city on the subject of immigration or the Back to Africa movement. In 1787, the Free Africa Union Society tried to establish its own settlement in Africa, and they actually took a group of participants back to Africa. But when the people of this group went back to Africa and established their settlement, they really had very little, if any, desire to merge with the native peoples in the communities or the groups surrounding their settlement. And they wanted their own clear title to their land. Now, this group, or this effort on the part of the Free Africa Union Society, actually predates the efforts of the American Colonization Society, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. The American Colonization Society is a group that's organized in the 19th century, and it's very different from the Free Africa Union Society in that the American Colonization Society is primarily an organization of very prominent white Northerners and white Southerners who are promoting or are trying to encourage free blacks to go back to Africa for their own reasons, for the Colonization Society's own reasons. And again, we'll talk about that a little later when we look at the protest or the challenges to slavery. Now, on the other hand, the Free African Society was established by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in 1787. It admitted only men at first, but in 1793, and it was established in Philadelphia. In 1793, the Philadelphia Female Benevolent Society of St. Thomas took over the welfare functions of the Free African Society. Free African Society also focused on the moral character of its members, and it was a self-improvement as well as a mutual aid society. It was very different from the Free African Union Society in that it had no interest in promoting immigration. It was also a non-sectarian group that attracted blacks from various Christian denominations, though it was most closely associated with the Quakers. Now, in 1787, there's another development that is also taking place as far as Richard Allen and Absalom Jones are concerned. In addition to organizing this Free African Society, Jones and Absalom withdrew their congregation from St. George's Methodist Church and established a separate church for blacks. Richard Allen had been a black pastor who had been allowed to preach to the black congregation or black members of St. George's Methodist Church. But he was asked to move his services to 5 a.m. on Sunday morning in order so that they would not disturb the white services. As the black congregation grew, whites were opposed to establishing even that separate black congregation or allowing them to have their services. As Allen recalled, the white minister used some very insulting language to try to prevent the black congregation from going outside of the church to have their services, but also tried to bar the members from continuing the services in the way that they were. The Free African Society was the solution to this, and they first established this group, but then later they went from encouraging blacks of any denomination to support the Free African Society to establishing the African Church of Philadelphia, where blacks could meet without regard to denomination. And that African Church of Philadelphia became the basis for what would eventually be two other denominations that were created by Allen and Jones. The Free African Church split into these two groups within a few years. They split into St. George's Episcopal Church, which was led by Absalom Jones, and Mother Bethel Methodist Church, which became the African Methodist Episcopal Church under the direction of Richard Allen. Black women played an important part in religious organizations, religious groups. Free black women were very active participants in church communities, most of them as congregants, but there were a few who were participants or who were lay preachers or what became known as exhorters. One of these was a woman by the name of Jarena Lee. You see her pictured on this slide. Jarena Lee was born in Cape May, New Jersey in 1809. She was the first woman known to petition the African Methodist Episcopal Church for the authority to preach. She was first denied this request. But then, after her marriage to a Methodist AME minister, Joseph Lee, and his subsequent death, she came back to the church again and made that request that she be allowed to preach. She asked to be permitted the liberty of holding, as she put it, prayer meetings in my own hired house and of exhorting as I found liberty. Now you notice she uses the expression exhorting, and that was very important because exhorting was something that the ministers of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, they were okay, they would allow women to consider themselves as exhorters, but to pastor a church was something different. Richard Allen, who was the bishop of the AME church at that time, granted her request and heard her preach and publicly acclaimed her talent. He thought she was a very gifted preacher, exhorter. Jarena Lee ended up preaching throughout the Northeast in the early 1800s. What she actually did was to basically ride circuit in the backcountry. In her autobiography, she describes some of her experiences, and she also points out that she was not the only black woman, who was doing this. She noted that there were other sisters in Christ, like Zilpha Elah, who was also a minister, a black minister during this period. She was a sister in Christ of Jarena Lee. Zilpha Elah was 12 years old when her father placed her as a servant with the Quaker family. She stayed there until she was 18. She was drawn to evangelical Protestantism, and she claimed to have had visions in which Christ came to her as a ghost with arms open to receive her while she was performing her chores. This visionary experience, according to one historian, was, for the most part, for black women evangelicals, this served as not only a way of transforming their lives, but it also allowed them a platform for criticizing the existing order, particularly slavery, racism, and sexism. At an 1817 camp meeting, Zilpha Elah claimed that she had had a visionary experience, gone into a trance, and that she believed she had received sanctification of her soul from God. That sanctification experience also enabled women to withstand the criticism of society. So this combination of the visionary experience and the sanctification were what she used as the basis for being able to go out and preach the gospel to other people, men and women. Zilpha Elah eventually, because she was very poor, she and her daughter were forced to find work as domestic servants, as maids, and she eventually opened a school for black children. So she uses her religious background, she uses the church as kind of a platform where she can support or can push other institutional reforms like education. Now, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with this woman, Sojourner Truth, but we're going to know her, we're going to describe her first as Isabella Baumfree. That was her given name. She was born in 1799 in New York. She was born a slave. One of the most important things to know about Isabella Baumfree, Sojourner Truth, is that she was another religious woman. We know her primarily for her stand on women's rights and against slavery. But her beginning, her roots, were in the religious movements of the early 1800s. In the 1830s, by the 1830s, she was preaching at camp meetings. I should say a little bit about her before that, though. She was born, as I said before, in 1799, which is really significant because you remember from an earlier chapter that it is in 1799 that New York State passes its gradual emancipation law. So she is born under the tenets of this graduate emancipation law, which provided that she would get her freedom in 28 years. By the time that she does receive her freedom, she has married and had several children, which her owner has sold away or indentured or whatever. In fact, she has one son who was sold away from her the year before she was actually allowed to get her freedom. But she sued in the courts and won his freedom, got him back essentially. Isabella, or Sojourner, experienced a dramatic religious conversion, joined a Methodist church, and attended Methodist and AME Zion, African Methodist Episcopal services in New York in the 1830s. By the early 1830s again, she's preaching at camp meetings. She joined a group called the Magdalene Society from 1832 to 1835 and came under the influence of the leader of the group, a man by the name of Matthias. Isabella was also influenced by the biblical prophecies of a man by the name of William Miller, who predicted that the world would come to an end in 1843. Isabella changes her name to Sojourner Truth in 1843, begins traveling in the South and exhorting people to embrace Jesus. So again, that term of an exhorter when it is what is applied to women, black female preachers during this period. Well, the world was supposed to come to an end on June the 1st, 1843, and when it didn't, Sojourner Truth, by now using that name, leaves the Millerites, joins another group called the Northampton Association, and begins to fight for the abolition of slavery and for women's rights. And then, of course, finally, another woman who is also very much involved in religion and social justice and all of this during this period. Another woman is Maria Stuart. She was born in 1803 to a free black family in Connecticut. She eventually married, had a son, but her husband died. And after his death, the person who was responsible for executing his will managed to cheat Maria Stuart out of her funds. So she has to eventually go to work as a teacher, as a writer, whatever. She was very much influenced by the AME Church in Boston. And one of her great friends of this period was David Walker. You're reading about him in this chapter, so you know that the role he has in the protest during this period, the protest against slavery. Maria Stuart published a pamphlet entitled Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build. Published this in 1831. Pamphlets had long titles during that time. She also published a pamphlet, Meditations from the Pen of Mrs. Maria Stuart, in 1832. And during this period, in the 1830s, she began to speak out for women's rights. The religious beliefs and activities often led black women to take these activist roles. And in fact, when we start to talk about activism in the next series of lectures, and we're looking at the role of the growing influence of the abolition movement, we're going to see that, again, most of this movement, most of the activity starts in the churches. Many moved from activism within their churches to organize and support women's mutual aid societies or literary societies, which became the bedrock for women's anti-slavery societies. Or some of them just simply called for fairer treatment of black women. Maria Stuart was an example of a black woman, free black woman, who took her religious beliefs into her community. Her public speaking, however, was not well received. This was possibly because she was critical of African American men for what she described as not doing enough within their own communities to take care of their families. She was the first American woman to participate in public political dialogues in 1832 and 1833, and in fact the first American woman to speak to mixed audiences of men and women. Eventually, she left the community, left Boston, and became a teacher in New York City, in Baltimore, and later in Washington, D.C. Now, I would also like to ask you to be sure to take a look at that YouTube video that's connected, or that you have a link for in this module, because when you visit, I'll go to that link, you'll hear a reading of an excerpt from one of Maria Stuart's speeches. And it is a speech in which she is very critical of the way in which black women are treated in these communities. And again, her criticism meant that her accomplishments, her activities were not well received. But again, you see that connection between religion as an institutional base that provides a way for people in general, for men and for women, to help in free black communities. Well, let's take a quick look by comparison at free black communities in the Upper South, where you'd find the overwhelming majority of free blacks in the South. In the Upper South, free blacks very often had family ties to slaves. Uh, this increased their suffering because they could never get too far away from the other members of their family. Very often they feared the sale of their friends and their loved ones sail further south into the Deep South. But they also gained a reputation for harboring fugitives, sometimes family members, sometimes just people from their communities, from their neighborhoods. They were at greater risk of being enslaved than free blacks in the northern communities, because in the Upper South and in other parts of the South, there was an assumption that slavery was the natural condition of black people in the southern states. So if you were a free black person, you had to essentially prove that you were free because the assumption was that you were enslaved. They had problems in traveling. There were restrictions on their ability to gather together, to congregate, to own firearms. They faced exclusions, greater exclusions, than free blacks who lived in the North, in the sense of being excluded from hotels, trains, parks, hospitals, etc. So the segregation that you saw in the North, of course, extended and was much more rampant in the South. In terms of employment, there was less competition for free blacks from European immigrants before 1850. Most free black men were essentially unskilled laborers doing the same kind of jobs that free black men did in northern urban areas. They might be waiters, they might be draymen, again, the men who drove the wagons, transporting goods. Most free black women were washerwomen or domestic servants in urban areas. In terms of education, there was no racial integration and no public funding for schools in much of the South. Most black children received no formal education. However, churches and individuals did provide some kinds, on occasion, sporadic opportunities for education. And in fact, in many urban areas in the Upper South, and I use Memphis as an example, free blacks might find education, and even slaves might find some education in what were called Sabbath schools that were operated by churches, white churches. People didn't see anything wrong with teaching blacks, slave or free, to read because they needed to be able to read the Bible. But teaching them to write was a different story because they might write a pass for themselves or for their friends, a pass that would get them away from a plantation. So reading of the Bible was something that could be taught in the Sabbath schools. Although by the mid-1850s, many urban communities had ordinances or had passed ordinances prohibiting the education of blacks or prohibiting whites from conducting Sabbath schools. And some states, many southern states, had also passed legislation that prohibited the education of blacks. In the Deep South, there were fewer manumissions of slaves, and where they were freed, those who were freed tended to be mixed-race children. In other words, they were the children of slaveholders, of white slaveholders. In the South, Deep South, there was essentially a three-caste system: whites, free blacks, and slaves. Free blacks there were strong ties between free blacks and their former masters because these were, of course, very often family. They were, of course, very often family. These ties provided ways for free blacks to acquire loans, jobs, and sometimes protection that they needed in an environment where their freedom was very often questioned. Free blacks in the Deep South tended to be better off economically than free black people in other regions. They tended to have access to property where free blacks in other regions did not. About half of the free blacks in the Deep South lived in the cities. They had stronger positions in terms of the skilled trades in these cities than free blacks in other parts of the South or in the North. But they also faced increased conflict and tension from white skilled workers, conflict, competition, and tension from white skilled workers. Now, we will pick up with our look at free blacks in the North in particular as we take a look in the next lectures, as we take a look at the activism and the abolition movements in the antebellum period.